Welcome to Let's with Amplify, where we have lively entrepreneurial talks focused on helping you grow your business through sound financial strategy. Here are your hosts, Jamie L. Smith and Jesse Ferguson.
Thanks for joining us. Let's with Amplify, lively entrepreneurial talks. Jesse, are you excited to talk about navigating business? Do you feel like you're the right person to have a conversation about navigating business?
As good as any.
As good as any. How
a broad topic.
Inspiring. So if you go back to when we decided to incorporate, that was May 2018, you officially left your former employer and came on board October 2018. If someone could have told you something about navigating business, what do you wish they would have told you? Or would you just never have listened anyways?
At the time, I definitely wouldn't have listened.
Okay, so assuming you would have listened, what would you wish that someone had said?
I don't think a lot of the mechanical things of running a business have really changed in my mind. Probably how incredibly valuable leadership is in terms of the ability to handle and solve problems. And then probably like people, right? Like you're not really, if you're running a team of robots, business would probably be a lot easier. But when you're running a team of people and they keep growing, you got to listen. You got to serve the people below you in terms of they turn into your business. So that was probably the biggest surprise that I've had. And what I could have probably, if I was listening at the time, I would have probably saved some headaches down the road.
I love it. I love it for two reasons. One, it hits on the first topic we're going to discuss today. And two, it's not misaligned with what I wish someone would have told me. I think obviously there's a recency effect, but to some degree, my lesson that I am the most surprised of from 2022 and still figuring out in 2023 is that whole idea of leader. Not everyone wants to be a leader. That was a hard lesson. Turns out some people like to actually be doers or
not everyone's motivated by the same things either, right?
Yeah, totally. So that has been a bit of a surprise. And had someone told me that, I think we could have saved ourselves a little bit of 2022 heartache and pain. So jumping into our actual topic, discussion on how growth businesses can grow with the right people, including financial leadership. And so we're going to talk a bit today about the executive bus. So right on topic with what both of us wish we had heard or listened to back in 2018. We're going to talk about the whole concept of, ouch, I hurt my head. I hit a ceiling in business. And so frequently it is that pain point of hitting your head on a ceiling in business that actually gives us an opportunity to help businesses with their people and their process and technology, because that's what drives them to take the big step of investing in themselves with us. We're going to talk a bit about an idealistic story. When do we need a CFO? What does it take within a business to need to invest in financial leadership? And we're going to talk about the accounting and finance function. It's not necessarily the department that people spend their time worrying about or thinking about. And as a result of that, they often don't actually understand who's who in the zoo when it comes to the accounting and finance function. So that's today's topic. Are you excited? Always excited. So the executive bus, there's the concept of right people, right seats. It comes from Traction and EOS. We hear it frequently. And, what does it really mean? What are some of the lessons or pain points you've seen in business, Jesse, that you want to touch on when it comes to that right person, right seat? But specifically, let's really target in on the executive bus and the leadership, because to our points earlier, I think that's an area that people maybe don't think about ahead of time enough.
I mean, all you can really do is look at our own failures in terms of lessons learned. I think leadership is tough. I think, especially in an early stage company where you probably don't have the money or capital to invest in seasoned executives. And oftentimes people are rushed into, I guess, leadership positions that they're probably not ready for. Even though they want the title, they don't actually know how to do the job. So take your time, get the right person, and grow from the bottom up versus the top down.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because we've got a couple succession plans going on now and some training people into leadership. And I was actually talking about it just this morning with my forum about how we've implemented more of a drip approach. And for a person who's not necessarily patient, which would be me, there's times where I find it not authentic, right? To be dripping, one task at a time, one concept, one objective at a time. But certainly the way that we're getting buy-in and learning and growth and new ideas from these new leaders that we're working with right now, it's proving that it might not be the natural way I would go about it, but it's certainly a better approach. And we're getting results quicker. Like there's that saying, you have to go slow with people in order to go fast. And it feels like we're seeing the results of that. If you slow down, do a drip approach, you actually get further quicker, which is a big surprise to me.
Yeah, I think I was having the conversation with another business owner the other day about this. And I think what complicates things is call it minority owners, minority shareholders, i.e., other business partners that maybe don't have the same skill set or maybe even the same drive. In this person's situation, they were talking about how their business partner who was running a certain aspect of their business was not invested in personal growth. And she freely admitted that, I don't know all the answers, but I'm continuously learning and continuously trying to figure it out. And she didn't feel like this person was. And, the question was asked well, have you asked her what she wants? Right. And he was like, no, I haven't. I just assumed they wanted the same thing as me. So, I think when you're dealing with non-shareholder, leaders, I think they're different situations and they need to be handled differently, right?
Definitely. So if we go back to the basic concepts of right person, right seat. Obviously, right person is about making sure there's the values alignment and ensuring that they're driven by the values and the North Star and the purpose and the strategy of the business. And then right seats is about that roles and responsibilities and understanding the skill set that's required in order to accomplish the tasks at hand for that position. We use a lot of the get it, want it capacity concept.
GWC.
Yeah, GWC, which basically to a large degree, the get it and want it would be that right person idea. And then the capacity is that right seat. One thing, I'd love to, will be vulnerable from an Amplify perspective. We've had a number of cases where we had the right person and we didn't have the right seat for them. So we tried to find the right seat for them over and over and over again. And pretty much our batting rate is 100% that they don't stay. And it doesn't work out. And I wonder, if you look back on those right people that were amazing people, we still love them to death. Like they're great values fit. They were really driven by the Amplify purpose. they were amazing professionals and people, but we didn't have the right seat for them. Do you regret trying to find the right seat for them, or do you think that it's a regret minimization where at least we can end amicably and recognize that we did everything we could to keep them? And do you also think that, maybe someday that won't result in a failure rate that we have now because we'll be big enough, there'll be more seats? Because ultimately, we're small, and so there's only so many seats. What are your thoughts on that? It's been painful for both of us. You more recently than me.
Yeah. I think the logical brain says you should have just moved on. I think the human brain, emotional EQ side of your brain says, I'm glad I gave it a chance. So how you live with that when you go to sleep at night, I guess that's, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and understand what, how you deal with, because, it's, you're dealing with people. It's not easy. People are, they matter. And so for some people, it's, they can cut a harder line. For others, they can't. So I think it's really depends on you as a person and what ultimately allows you to sleep easy at night.
Definitely. I think it's something that we see in so many of our clients is that growth businesses are often invested in their team and their people almost more than anything. And one of the consequences of that is they can be slow to fire for sure and slow to move on. But, it's two sides of the same coin. It's also what generally drives their success and ultimately their profit. And it's one of their strengths as well.
For sure.
So when we get more targeted towards that CFO seat on the executive bus, one of our ahas, we heard Jan Eden speak about the CFO being a lookout position, and that to some degree, their number one job was being a steward on the hill, watching for external financial risks and opportunities and understanding the financial health and situation internally. And she talked about how a CFO and their relationship with the CEO is critical. I loved that concept from Jan about the CFO lookout position and recognizing that financial expertise and where it sits. And I thought a lot of her words about be a steward on the hill, watch for external risks and opportunities, understand the health, could be transferable to, like, if you're the CMO, it's the marketing risks and opportunities and the marketing health and brand health. If you're the COO, it's the operational risks and opportunities and the operational health of the business. I thought a lot of her comments were transferable. When you think about an executive, Jesse, do you think, again, just to repeat it, CFO is a lookout position, number one job, steward on the hill, watch for external financial risks and opportunities, understand the financial health and situation internally, and be the CEO role and the relationship is critical. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, she got it pretty hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. She's coached a lot of the biggest CFOs in town, as well as some of the more instrumental, agile ones too. So it makes sense. She knows what she's talking about. It kind of raises the question, though, and we were talking about this a little bit the other day, and I actually stopped the conversation because I wanted to have it fresh and authentic here in front of a mic. So there's a few concepts with executives. Should you be running an executive team where each individual is a department or functional expert, and they're the right-hand man, as they like to say, of the CEO, and they're really there in support to fill the gaps of the CEO and to drive the execution on behalf of the CEO, and then maybe in turn the CEO and the board. So in that case, you would show up as the CFO, representing accounting and finance, representing your financial leadership expertise, and you're very much territorial department representative. You'd have the marketing department doing the same for the marketing area, the sale, maybe the VP sales showing up and pushing for their sales team and for the revenue line. And everybody would have a bit of a territorial aspect. There's a bit of a silo, obviously. But at the end of the day, the CEO would have all these experts And they, in turn, would be able to leverage and pull from that team. So that's one extreme. And then another extreme would be where, no, when we show up, we are showing up as executives and we're showing up as business leaders first. And the driver is the strategy and growth and goals of the company. And we leave our functional department representation at the door. And that's another job we have. But when we're here at this table around this boardroom, it's about the company and the strategy and the goals. And we're business leaders first and then experts second. So two extremes. And I think most companies don't live in either extreme. But to a large degree, I've been telling our CFOs, figure out where they lean on the spectrum, both from a current state and an aspirational state, because it changes the way you should be showing up and it changes the way that you talk and the language you use. So my first question, Jesse, is, of the two, the territorial functional expert or the business leader first, which one do you think is the most common or the most successful, which might not be the same?
What is the most common? I don't see normally, I wouldn't say like extremes in either one, but if you were to like lean towards one or the other, I would say in bigger businesses, it's probably more departmental, professional managers managing their specific areas and less cross-business focused. And in more entrepreneurial high growth companies, it's probably more, showing up. It's about business strategy. And I'm sure, again, this is like, in terms of their number one priority, I think they're always going to be both, but like, what's their number one priority? I'd say, the clients we work with is probably more business strategy first versus department. Most of them don't even have their enough structure to define that anyways. So we're probably the first introduction into a structure and roles and responsibilities.
And do you think one's better than the other, or do you think that it depends?
I think it depends. I think it's a fine line because, you can get executive teams where you got people poking their nose way too much into other people's business and, you can get CFOs that are trying to take over operations or take over HR or take over strategy. And so I don't think that is a good thing, right? It has to be collaborative and bringing a viewpoint on, how you can help the business versus everyone is a bunch of idiots and if they just knew better and listened to me. So, and you see that a fair amount from especially the CFO lens and definitely the operations lens. So, I think that's a risk that you can go down too much if you're almost too collaborative in terms of like blending the lines on an executive team of everyone's just a business stakeholder. But at the same time, execution does matter. And, if you're not laser focused on the priorities that you need to do in your kind of functional area to execute on that business strategy, well, then the business strategy doesn't even matter anyways. So, probably pretty gray. If I was to lean one way or another, I'd probably go 51% on department.
51%?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. That's doesn't surprise me. I figured that's what you'd say. And having been the person that kept getting poked with with someone's nose going in their business. I didn't love that.
Yeah, it's not fun. Why are you doing this?
Yeah, leave me alone. It's working. I think you're right, though. It is pretty gray, but I think it's critical for executive teams to actually step back and ask themselves, how are we supposed to show up? And, to what degree is it gray? To what degree should we be business leaders first? And to what degree are we representing our expertise or our department? And just making assumptions is dangerous when it comes to language and expectation management. One thing that we talk about with our CFOs, and I'm a big believer of this and interested to see your thoughts on it, Jesse. I think, as an executive, one thing I think is true personally is that you're not an order taker. And so you should be coming to the table with your idea of what the priorities are, or your rocks if you're in an EOS world or what have you. And you have a starting point of what you think needs to get done within your function, within your time, within your roles and responsibilities. And then certainly when you collaborate as a team, those priorities might change because you start to have a better appreciation for the bigger picture and how everything fits in together and, where things are linear or there's interdependency. So in no way am I suggesting that you come to the table and tell them what you're doing and that's that. But I do think you should come to the table with the first draft, and hopefully that draft's somewhere between 30 and 80% correct. It won't be 100% correct. If it is, you're not listening and you're not accepting feedback. But I personally think there's a little bit of an absolute in the sense that if you're an executive and you're literally being told what to do, that either you have a team that's not an actual executive team or you yourself are not showing up as an executive. What are your thoughts on that from that executive bus seat?
One, they have to be permitted to actually have autonomy. Mistake probably we've made in the past. So don't call them an executive if you actually just want a yes man. And if you do allow them to, then yeah, you do have to allow you have to allow people in their departments to come to the table with ideas, some good, some bad. And, be able to have those open conversations and not sweep things under the rug if they're not going well. And you see that a lot, right? Especially in teams that actually have close relationships from a friendship perspective, where they don't want to hurt people's feelings. So, does that answer your question?
I think so. So I think, both of us said that had we been navigating business back in 2018 and willing to take other people's advice, the area that we would have wanted to hear the most about was leadership and people and that executive bus. So I think
it's probably the same thing, I guess.
It's
saying it in a different way.
It's the starting point for sure. And as people navigate growth, getting that leadership team right is critical to scale. And if you want to move to the next stage in business, this is point A, absolutely. So let's talk a bit about what it means to move into different stages of business and how we see so frequently businesses hit a ceiling. And obviously that ceiling is often advantageous for us because oftentimes they hit a ceiling, they cannot move to the next stage of business. And as a result, they're excited and willing to bring a CFO on, to bring other financial leaders on, or to bring on technology and process such as NetSuite. So obviously we love businesses hitting ceilings because it's almost always the reason they call us. But it's because we solve a problem. And let's not forget that hitting a ceiling in business is a problem. And so obviously investing in people, process, and technology can certainly move you to the next business stage. That's critical. And we'll talk a bit about that. But there's other things that can also move you from one stage to the next in terms of financing or looking at that team, and looking at financial strategy and what stage you're in and being able to identify it. So first, Jesse, when you think about the stages of business, there's different words. We obviously have pretty decent collateral and thought leadership on it, but just in your own words, what are the stages of businesses that you see and where the ceilings are most frequently hit?
What are the stages? Well, obviously, startup would be the first one, pre-revenue. And then as they come out of that, they generally will start selling their product or service. And then usually that kind of lasts for a while. And then they probably hit a certain number of employees where, the founders of that business are kind of stretched too thin. And so they start hiring a lot. And then that goes well or doesn't. But let's assume it goes well. And then they generally feel like they've lost control. And then usually something bad happens. Whether it's, someone spends too much money on something or health and safety issue or, something. And so they realize that, they need more structure, they need more process, maybe different people, and then so on and so forth. Usually by the time they kind of get to that, let's say, third level of growth, we kind of, our fractional CFOs are usually not there anymore, maybe. That's the idea, if it's gone really well.
Because there's a permanent CFO that recruiting put in.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. So. Well, it's interesting because a couple things that you brought up, that team that got you there. And if we think about the personalities of an entrepreneur or the concept of a joiner, right? So obviously an entrepreneur takes major risks, often is visionary, and unless they're a reluctant entrepreneur, but they're looking to achieve something and they're looking to take those risks and build something and be part of something that's new and exciting. And then there's the joiners, which are the early people that join entrepreneurial startup companies that, let's not discount the fact that they're taking major risks too. Not a lot of CFOs are excited about becoming a joiner, hence why they'd rather work with Amplify. So they get the opportunity to work in those early stage, high risk companies, but they don't actually have to be on those payrolls or be 100% exclusive to those companies. It takes a risk to be a joiner. You're looking at an uncertain future, uncertain cash flow, which results in payroll concerns. Oftentimes you have to buy your job, right? In order to be a joiner, you actually have to invest or else there's no seat for you. So, is that team that helps you build and start up a business the same team that's going to get you to 5, 10, 15 million? And how hard is it to recognize that maybe it's not?
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Is that because they don't have the skill set? Maybe. I think certain personalities fit for certain life cycles of a business, right? Some people get excited about chaos and something being new and being created every single day, and some people, to them, that it sounds like a real nightmare. So I think there's also a factor of just burnout as you go through, especially early stage companies. Those joiners are generally tons of stress, tons of pressure, tons of responsibilities, and by the time you get into stability, they're probably a little bit burnt out, and by that point, it's time to move on. So, yeah, generally you don't see it through. That's for sure. But I think it depends on the growth curve for sure. If it's manageable, steady growth, then you see probably more people sticking around.
Being able to adapt at a slower pace.
Exactly.
What about, process and technology? Sometimes I see some of our clients, the reason they're excited about being part of a startup or an early stage business is because there's less rules. It's more agile. They don't have to deal with process. They don't have to deal with policy. They don't have to deal with documentation. They don't have to deal with sophisticated technology, which requires all of the above. And then when you get to a certain stage where you need scale, all of a sudden the pros and cons of process and rules and policy and sophisticated automation outweigh the agile, free flow, off the seat of your pants type of approach. And that can be really difficult if you were the one that didn't have to follow a rule before.
Mm-hmm. Is there a question on that?
Yeah. How many times have you seen that? I think even about the stories that...
I think it happens a lot, whether they actually recognize that that's the problem. Maybe not. But yeah, I think it definitely happens. I'd say it's not usually for employees. It's probably your early stage founders not wanting to follow the rules that they put in for the guardrails they put in for their team. But yeah, I think it happens a lot.
So you're trying to grow your business. You're looking at the ceilings that you hit. And you realize you don't have the people, you don't have the process, you don't have the technology, maybe you don't have the financing. The next stage is going to take maybe some equity or some debt or some investment. You're possibly the people that got you there are not as excited about what it's going to take to get to the next stage. I guess the question could be, do you even want to be at the next stage? Sometimes businesses and entrepreneurs are so committed to growth and being on a treadmill that they don't actually step back and ask themselves, maybe it would be worth realizing what it takes to get there. And that's not actually why you went into business in the first place. Have you seen businesses actually have a constrained approach or slow down? And because they thought this through, or most of them just keep going without pausing?
I mean, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, they get into it because they have an idea and they think the world needs them. And I don't think they think too much about where that's going to end up. And then all of a sudden it works and they're like, just keep doing that. At some point, either burnout or something happens where they start looking, where the hell am I going? But yeah.
So one thing that's certain is when you hit ceilings in business, that's when you got to start reevaluating that executive bus and that executive team. And oftentimes that means deciding whether or not you're ready for a CFO. It's not too common that we run into that many industries where the founders or the initial leadership team includes a finance leader. And so there's a realization, okay, if I want to move from being a $1 million business to a $5 million business or $5 million business to a $20 million business, that I need financial strategy. And I can't keep bootstrapping and doing my own bookkeeping and doing my forecasts on the back of a napkin. So when exactly do you need a CFO? And I think Amplify's perspective is, if your revenue is over $1 million, if your plans for revenue are over $5 million, if your team is over 10 people, and you have either banking or investor relations, that you need a CFO. So what we've seen in our businesses that we are helping, if they hit all four, they're over $1 million, they have plans to be over $5 million, they have more than 10 people employed, and they have a banking or investor relationship, they already need a CFO. Why do you think that those things drive the need to bring in that extra person on that executive bus?
Complexity, probably, right? Most businesses that have those growth aspirations probably are adding complexity into their business, and with complexity comes various risk and challenges. And, unless you have the specific expertise to be able to manage that risk and complexity, then bringing in an expert to do that is definitely the right way to go. So,
and even if you have an inkling of that expertise, it's often a distraction of what you're there to do, right? So those CEOs or COOs that are actually quite financially literate and astute, that's not their number one priority within the business. And so every minute they spend on forecasting or cash flow management is a minute they're not selling or leading their team or achieving their strategic goals. And so, in some ways it's almost harder when you have a bit of the expertise on that bus.
I mean, it depends what their day-to-day looks like, right? Like if you're actually achieving those business goals, that meeting that growth, and you have to prioritize running the business versus working in the business. So and that can be tough for people, for sure. It's tough for me.
Interested in diving deeper into the topic of this episode? Every episode of Let's with Amplify has an accompanying ebook for you to download absolutely free. Visit amplifyadvisors.ca/category/Let's Media to get access to the accompanying ebook for this episode. Each ebook helps you get the most out of the discussion that we have on each and every show. Head over to amplifyadvisors.ca/category/Let's Media to get access to the ebook now.
The opposite, when you think about how you describe that it's complexity that really is what brings all of that in common and why a financial leader can make a difference. The opposite of that is a stable, less growing business. So we always joke around about the analogy of a pizza shop on the corner, which might be earning all kinds of amazing revenue, have a great brand within the community, but there's no intention of opening a second pizza shop. And so, those businesses we don't serve because we don't add value.
Yep.
And I think your initial response and reaction of complexity is exactly at the core of that.
Totally. Yeah. It's an analogy we use often, and it holds true as much today as it did when we started the business. So, and complexity goes up and down too, right? Like, you could add some new products and services or new locations, and next thing you know, you figure that out, and then it becomes stable, and then it's not very complex anymore. That's just regular business. And so do you need a CFO at that point if you're not planning on doing anything more? That CFO is going to be bored, right? And so the ability to scale up and down your hours on a CFO is, especially in smaller, mid-sized companies, is actually a huge benefit for a company. So that, when I was at Graph, it was very much like that, where lots of challenges, lots of complexity, figured a lot of that out over long hours and many tiers. But once that was figured out, it was like, okay, what's next? Well, there wasn't much money to do what's next, and so it became pretty boring, right? Only, needing to probably be there a few days a week. So, it's, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, the complexity, obviously, to your earlier point on the executive bus and what you wish you had heard in 2018, I think people are inherently complicated. So while I absolutely agree with you that it's a beautiful thing when your new product or new service becomes standard business. I mean, we've had that happen on subservices and
that's true. People
services. But then
always add complexity.
Yeah, but then you unless you're a business that's 100% scalable and it's not and they're not growing people, there's always that people complexity, which should be an attention focus of most leadership teams, which time spent on a forecast or cash flow management is time not spent on your people. So I think that kind of reduces the opportunity to ever really get into a nice stable spot. But I hear you for sure. So, and that goes to the teams over 10 people. And the other point that you brought up that I think is important about how many people you employ drives when you need a CFO is you said something about someone spends your money. And this is so true, because if you're a small startup, there's a lot of empowerment and spending authority, maybe at all levels of leadership. But even if you don't give a credit card out to your COO, or you don't allow him or her to spend money on behalf of the company, when you're a tiny team, you just inherently know every dollar that's being spent. In fact, I was thinking about the other day, because I made a spend that I felt was a big spend. And I was thinking to myself, 3 or 4 years ago, I would have talked to you about that like 7 times to the sun to make sure you knew I was spending that. And the other day I spent it without having like fully talked to you about it, but it's in our budget and it's not unexpected. And it just goes to prove, like, now that we're a team of 40 and we're bigger, like, I don't have the opportunity or time to talk to you about every $300 that I spend.
Yep.
And so, hence the need for a CFO, because all of a sudden you've got 5, 6, 7 people, like, you don't have your finger on the pulse of what's being spent. And if you try to have that kind of control, wow, what a distraction from strategy and getting shit done, right? So more people means less transparency on where things are being spent, and then there's the risk and the process and all the rest.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'd add to that, like, I think there are, though, a lot of business owners that think like a CFO is going to just like, he's just there to approve those things, right? It's like maybe at the start, but if you have really where the value is actually setting up a scalable process system that allows for infrastructure to control that type of thing that meets and fits within your own kind of business philosophy or business environment that you run. So yeah. But I wouldn't, there are definitely a lot of, like, they think of it as a cost control measure, right? But, to me, it's actually more just risk mitigation.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's a very common stereotype that CPAs and CFOs and finance and accounting people are all about cost and focused on cost. Now, I would argue that the vast majority of our peers deserve that stereotype and are only focused on costs and that part of the P&L and the income statement, but certainly not a good CFO and certainly not an Amplify one. But I think it does come down to exactly what you're saying. If you have a budget in place, then you have guardrails for the spend. And you have the ability to forecast those spends because the timing has been set in the budget. And then you recognize, well, what's the process to get it, to have the expenditure and get the approval, and especially when it's not an expected or timing or amount. And all of those processes and risk mitigations is where the value can be when we're talking about costs in particular.
Sure.
And more people just means that leaning into those processes and leaning into those policies saves everybody time and attention and decision making, which is one of the reasons why bigger teams means the need for a financial leader.
Sure.
When we look at revenue in particular, and it comes right down to your concept of complexity, once you're at $1 million, you often have a proven product or service or brand. That's a common theory, and I think that it's a good theory. Prior to $1 million, you might be chasing a market or trying to solve a problem that no one actually appreciates or values. But once you start hitting $1 million,
I think it depends on your average selling price.
True, yeah. I mean, if you only have one customer,
if you're
80%.
House builder in the home building business, you're probably not very successful at 1 million.
Yeah, that's true.
Built one house.
Yeah, one house in these markets.
You know, in a lower price point business where you need that 1 million has produced a lot of volume, then sure, yeah, definitely.
And then, at that point, when you have some kind of establishment in terms of, okay, I'm solving a problem that people value, people actually want this product, they want this service, then obviously you've got choices. If you plan to grow over 5 million, are you going to dig in further and get more volume of clients or higher value opportunities, or are you going to differentiate and diversify based on this core expertise or competency you have? And all of those choices, whether it's just the same thing and more of it, or diversified options and new packaging or what have you, all of that is complexity. So I think, the idea that a CFO is required for a company that has over $1 million in revenue and plans to grow over 5 million really does come down to that, is that there's a lot of choices and optimization of, what products make you money, what services make you money, which ones are loss leaders or brand establishers. Like, there's a lot of information there and decisions to be made that great financial data can accelerate the opportunity so much faster.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I don't think that's how people back their way into the CFO seat. That's for sure. Or
no, I agree. But it would be nice if they did.
If they were that rational, yeah, that'd be awesome. Unfortunately, I've been there myself where you're like, I just need help. I can't do this all. I need help. And in some ways, that's probably not a bad thing. If you're at the point where you need help, whether it's I need better visibility over my operations and finances, or I need, someone to take over this banking relationship or what have you. Would you like to have a better plan and be more calculated? Sure, but that's generally not how life works. You generally seek out help when you're in trouble. So, hence
why this part of the discussion is the idealistic story, because it is very idealistic. You nailed it.
Much reality to it.
And
actually, in fact, when we've been idealistic, it hasn't worked out well. So
that's true. Sometimes it's like playing house.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Trial and error.
Yeah. You did raise though the banking and investor relationship, which I think is, a critical thing to think about. The idealistic story, the idealistic me wonders why people
why they wait so long.
Yeah, why do you lend money to people that don't have financial leaders on board? And why do you give money to companies that don't have financial leadership? But the reality is that...
Great stories.
Great stories, yeah. Exactly. And so, you start playing with other people's money, and yet you don't have a financial leader on that executive team. And it just, to me, seems like an unnecessary thing to keep you up at night, right? Like, why? And I have had the privilege of having you as a CFO, which has been great. And I wouldn't want to be borrowing people, and we don't even borrow people's money really, just for working capital at best. I can't even imagine taking someone else's money and being on the hook for someone else's money and not having like a second set of eyes that had a financial leadership lens. I just can't even imagine. But yet,
I don't think we're very normal though.
Maybe not, because most clients that we do onboard already have debt or equity and other people's money, certainly.
Sure. Yep.
And that's often what keeps them up at night and what makes it so challenging to deal with those cash flow issues and the complexities that you noted.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to, they probably got the money because they needed it. It was an emergency, and so they bring it in, and then that money goes to work, and next thing you know, you have more emergencies, and then they realize I need help. So
yeah, the reporting, the compliance, the covenants, everything that goes along with using other people's money is a very time-constraining and depleting activity for a lot of business owners. And having an expert do that and manage the communication and the storytelling of the money can just make a big difference in terms of those relationships with investors and bankers. So, you know, again, it's an idealistic story for sure, but without question, we've been doing this for going on 5 years, and businesses that earn over $1 million in revenue and have plans of revenue for over 5 million and teams of over 10 and have banking and investor relationships, the sooner they get the CFO, the better they're going to get a return on that investment, and the more success they're going to have as an executive team and get them past those ceilings that they hit in business when they're trying to get to another stage. So before we move on, any other things you'd want to point out on navigating business?
No.
So the boring part of the conversation, but essential, is, you know, who is the accounting and finance function? And I always say, you know, COVID to some degree was a blessing for Amplify, because if you remember, it was a while ago, pre-COVID, Jesse, but if you remember, we were still part of the sales team. And how much time did we spend explaining to people what a CFO was? Like pretty much the entire sales cycle. Don't you think?
Yeah.
It was crazy. And so the sales cycle was always an educational process. Who's a CFO? Why do I need a CFO? What is a CFO? And I do think that the pandemic, one of the blessings that we've seen is that people have a much better understanding of what a CFO is and why they need a finance leader. And they certainly didn't come to that education in a way that they'd want to repeat or that they're happy about, but they recognized, wow, I don't know if I'm going to make it through this crisis, or I don't have the ability to apply for these business grants and government opportunities.
Yep. And
as a result, they realized, okay, my tax advisor does great work in tax, and my bookkeeper does great work in recording the historical data of my company, but I don't have a finance leader. And so it's a great feeling to know that people now are approaching us and looking for finance leaders and looking for CFOs. I personally don't think that this moment in the sun's going to last. I think we'll be back to no one caring what the difference between a CFO and a tax expert and a bookkeeper and a controller is, but I'm enjoying the warmth at the moment. What are your thoughts? Do you think it'll last forever, or people will forget quickly?
I think it'll last forever.
Oh, really? You're more glass half full than me?
Yeah.
That never happens.
Well, I mean, I think there's. I say it out of pessimism. Actually, pessimism.
Oh, okay, now I'm getting more comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, there's to think COVID was the last, macro economic thing that is going to impact businesses. I think that'd be naive. I mean,
oh, you're not talking pessimistic then. You're talking like doomsday.
Well, no, I don't think doomsday, but banks are collapsing in the States again, right? There's
true.
There's a crazy amount of inflation. There's headwinds, risks. There's lots of things going on that are external to companies, and I think that risk will only drive the need for more smart people being around boardroom tables. And one of those seats is a CFO, and that need will continue to be felt. And I think people are waking up to the fact that, hey, in the gig economy, I can hire a really smart person for a fraction of the cost, and actually get the right level of attention and service that I need from that seat. And so I think now that it's become more trendy, I would say, I don't see that going away. If anything, it's going to grow because I think business is going to get more complicated, more regulations, right? More globalization, maybe just change in general. So.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, the education, speaking of the sales process and education, back when we originally started, we were one of the only fractional executive firms in town, and even in Western Canada, it wasn't a frequent experience. So people didn't understand what fractional was and what that meant. And to your point, I think that it has become trendier and it's become much more understood, and recognizing that your strategy and your goals are of a certain level of complexity and sophistication, but yet you don't want the payroll of a $200,000+ executive because you can't afford it, and maybe you don't have 60+ hours worth of executive work for that person yet. The opportunity to not sacrifice that level of leadership and get what you actually need at a practical and scalable perspective is definitely becoming much more well understood, for sure.
Yep.
So, speaking of that, let's dive in a little bit. Who is a CFO? Who's a controller? Who's a bookkeeper? Who's a tax expert? And what are the differences? So, we obviously have amazing friends in the tax world. They're all very busy at this time of year. And we would not classify ourselves as tax experts. We're not a tax registered CPA firm either. So even if we are experts individually, we're not permitted from a compliance perspective to do taxes for our clients. But we do them from a CFO seat and from a controller seat and a bookkeeper seat. So, Jesse, for those that don't live and breathe the accounting and finance function, what's your definition of a tax expert so that people get it?
I think there's two aspects. One that actually does the compliance, and then planning of minimization of tax. So strategy, legal structures, all that fun stuff that generally people that live and breathe the regulations and legislation understand very well and can advise clients on. And then obviously there's the people that actually just hammer out tax returns and make sure keep you out of jail.
And so what is your favorite thing to talk about? No, I'm kidding. It's not your favorite. That would be hockey or NetSuite. But one of your favorite things to talk about is the risks of turning to your tax partner with a CFO question and thinking that you don't need a CFO because the partner at the accounting firm you work with is just an incredible business leader helping you in all ways a CFO would help.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge with, to be honest, not just a tax advisor, like with any advisor, is how well do they know your business, right? They're picking up your file once a year, and twice a year, maybe you go for lunch, you tell them, do they really understand your strategy? Do they really understand like the nuances of how your business operates? I don't know. I've been there, and I'd say it's a pretty bold statement to say that as an advisor, you're in that level of understanding of your clients. You're paid to answer as an advisor specific pointed questions, but not, have a broad enough lens that you can give advice on what they're not looking for or what they don't know, right? So,
or they didn't ask.
Or they did, exactly. They didn't ask. I think that's a better way to put it. And so, it's not to say, your year-end accountant that you go talk to for a year-end meeting about how you did and your taxes is a valuable conversation. I think it is. And I think it's a conversation even when you're managing risk financially that you probably should still have, because hell, if they it might minimize your taxes in the future, right? But from a strategic level perspective, I think it's asking a lot of those people to, and I've seen people like that get thrown under the bus, which I don't think is fair either. This girl told me this, and it's like, okay, well, you just ran with that advice instead of actually looking for different viewpoints. Probably the onus lies more on the CEO, business owner than that tax accountant, but that's just the reality of the industry. I went to you. You know my business. Why didn't you help me get through this financial challenge? It's like, okay.
Yeah, and I think what frustrates me when people think their tax expert is the equivalent of their CFO is exactly what you're speaking of. There's no way when you look at the number of clients that person has to serve that they can understand your strategy and your business in a way that's intimate enough to be expected to be making these decisions essentially for you or with you, which is what a CFO does. They make decisions in some cases for you and in some cases with you, depending on the role and responsibilities and nature of the decision. And so that's, that is unfair to that tax expert. Further to that point, most tax experts grow up in the firm having been maybe an auditor and a tax expert. So they've never been necessarily a business leader, and they've never necessarily worked in an operational business. They've worked in a firm, which is a very unique type of business and not necessarily transferable or relatable to most of their clients. So I think that is something that we sometimes forget, is that, yes, they're a business leader, and oh my goodness, they know more important things than most of us, because tax is very complicated and very important. But that doesn't necessarily transfer to being a business leader from an operational, strategic perspective. And then the last thing to point out, which goes back to what you pointed out at the 2018, what you wanted to hear, and we talked about it a lot with the executive bus and everything else, is the people side. Often people are the most complex parts of a business, and whether a decision is a good decision or a bad decision is going to be very much anchored on your people and your culture. And the chances that your tax expert has any real exposure to that is almost nil. Like, it's highly unlikely that they're exposed to anything about your people or your culture. So very unfair to expect them to have a good business leadership point of view without knowing such a fundamental part of your business, I think.
Yep.
Bookkeepers, obviously, many business owners will lean on their bookkeeper far past the point of the bookkeeper's capacity or even desire. When we talk about it not being fair on the tax expert, it's even arguably less fair to expect your bookkeeper to be stepping up in the role of a CFO or controller, because they have a volume of clients that they need to serve, and they do great work. And that work is detail oriented, it's record keeping, it's compliance, it's historical. And to expect them to step out of those weeds is hard. I mean, you and I have experienced this ourselves. The minute you get into the weeds, when you try and step out of and see the forest from the trees and make big decisions based on trends and the full picture, it's hard for anybody, even if they have that skill set, because you're so tied into the details. What would you say that the biggest difference, like, how would you describe a bookkeeper so that business owners understand what a bookkeeper is in the function of accounting and finance?
Somebody that understands how to record transactions but has no idea about a balance sheet. Which is not their skill set. So that's definitely not a knock. But too many times you go into a business owner and, they don't understand why their bookkeeper can't, their balance sheet is being questioned by the bank. And you're like, well, there's about 5 years worth of parked items there. So, they've never been dealt with. Probably need to deal with them. So,
yeah, fair point. They're oftentimes a bookkeeper.
Good with collections, good with invoicing, good with payroll, good with general accounting journal entries. Sometimes not really there. But yeah, good with like day-to-day accounting transactions and your income statement. Sometimes not as expenses. Sometimes not that either. But a lot of these accounting softwares too, they handle that pretty well these days in terms of, your general day-to-day transactions. So, but generally, yeah. That back office kind of transactional function which is important. And a good bookkeeper, I wouldn't overvalue there's a lot of not very strong bookkeepers out there. So good bookkeepers are definitely, if you can find them, super valuable, but they also have a ceiling, right?
Absolutely. So now if we go into the more complex area, the finance leader area, you've got the CFO and you've got the controller. And many times we have businesses approach us saying they need a controller and want a controller. And, question number one is this a cost-driven decision? Do you want a controller because you think it's cheaper? And we've made the hard decision, the strategic decision, that we don't sell fractional controller to companies that don't have someone functioning as a CFO. Because we believe it's a cost-driven decision, and we believe that the controller will be set up to fail, and the business will ultimately try and get the controller to step up into a CFO role of which they don't have the capacity or the scope or the potentially the experience to do. Obviously, in our recruiting department, we're less idealistic because we're serving a need that's predefined by the client. So certainly we are placing controllers on a regular basis in companies that don't necessarily have a CFO. And that's a risk that they're taking on instead of us. And oftentimes they are successful. Without question, we see controllers sometimes rise to the occasion and do great work and run a successful accounting and finance function. Jesse, if you could describe what the difference between a CFO and controller is in a few words or sentences, how do you look at it?
Someone that looks backwards and someone that looks forward. That's about it.
And for our listeners, who's who?
Someone looks backwards and tells the accurate story is a really good controller. Someone looks forward is a really good CFO. And usually they aren't the same person.
Absolutely. So when we think about that looking backwards that you're speaking of for a controller, it's about leading the accounting and finance team, ensuring that you've got that foundation, you've got the good data, it's accurate, it's timely, you're set from a compliance perspective, historical information is all there. And we know that history often repeats itself, and the best forecasts start with great historical foundational data. And that's how you start every good forecast. That's how you just start every good financial strategy and decision. So in no way should anybody understate the importance of a controller.
Critically important.
Absolutely. And I would argue that you cannot be a good CFO if that controllership and that foundation isn't taken care of, correct, no matter how good you are.
Yep, correct.
But a CFO, to your point, is looking forward. So it's about the financial strategy, the overall contribution to strategy and business leadership, and, making those decisions that are opportunistic. So, a CFO is going to spend more time thinking about growth and revenue and how that balance sheet supports the capital needs and the banking and investor relationships go forward. And a controller often isn't going to have that opportunity. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about. To some degree, even if they have that skill set, they're in the weeds so much that they don't necessarily have even the chance to step out and see the bigger picture. And then in other cases, they're just not there from a years or experience or skill set perspective.
Yeah, I think there's lots of good controllers that can turn into really good CFOs. I think it really depends on, good CFOs are pretty business savvy. really understand kind of business risk, really understand pricing, sales, right? Or financing, obviously. They have a pretty broad, I guess, experience base. And that takes time to develop. So, you often see I often talk to a lot of controllers that are more junior, earlier in their careers, and they think because they can hammer a month end out and have really accurate books that qualifies them for the seat above them. And sometimes that's the case, I guess. I never say it doesn't happen, but most of the time they're missing a big piece, and that's usually years of experience, right? So, yeah.
So when we hire, I often, and I mean, I've been burnt, so I learned this the hard way for sure, but I often tell our CFO candidates, we don't put people in CFO/controller seats anymore. And every job that we do, there's someone in the controller seat, whether it's Amplify and we're the entire accounting department with a bookkeeper, a controller, and a CFO, or in other cases, someone else is holding that controller seat internally. As a team that we inherit or what have you. So the CFO and the controller seat are always held by two different people, and we only sell them separately. And that's the case with 100% of our accounting and finance leader clients these days. But having said that, every day in small, medium business, our CFOs are doing controller work. So they don't hold the job. It's not their roles and responsibilities in terms of what they're assigned and the scope that they're responsible for, but they're going to do controller work. And they're going to do it because small, medium business is going to have peaks and valleys in terms of work. There's going to be vacation coverage. There's going to be transactions. There's going to be fixing things. Some of the controllers, certainly not the Amplify controllers, obviously, but the controllers we inherit often aren't fully up to capacity in terms of doing the controller job. So you got to roll up your sleeves, teach them and shadow them and really get into the weeds with them. And so, that's been a big evolution for us at Amplify, being willing to have the courage to set these roles and responsibilities, set these expectations, and often walk away from companies that aren't willing to look at it our way, and grateful that we don't actually have to walk away because recruiting can often help them and serve their needs their way. But the finance leader department does have to walk away. If you think back as to what a CFO/controller is and why we have stepped away from it, like what are your thoughts and what would you want a business owner to understand about that CFO/controller concept? If they think someone can fill that whole job. And there's also business owners that think that one CPA can do bookkeeping, CFO, and controller, which is even more broad and impossible.
Well, you just have to step back and ask them what they're good at, right? Are they good at sales, operations, marketing, finance, all? Do they have that broad a skill set? Because they're different skill sets, and being able to understand that very, very difficult to find unicorns that can do it all. And even if they can do it all, do they want to do it all, right? So, yeah. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the evolution of a career, well, I wouldn't say that most of us start as bookkeepers and then move to controller necessarily, but to your earlier point, many CFOs were controllers first, especially if they're CPA accounting background. But yeah, just because it's 40 hours worth of work, how many CPAs are going to be willing to do 20 of those hours in bookkeeping, right? Very, very few, at least not for long. And then
it's got to be short-lived.
It's got to be short-lived, exactly. Which is, where the fractional concept is just an amazing opportunity for small, medium business because it could be 40 hours of work, but let's split it between a bookkeeper, a controller, and CFO. So everyone's more engaged and bought in. Plus you have the oversight and that reduces risk, et cetera. So it's a great opportunity for sure. So we're wrapping up navigating business and discussing how growth businesses can grow with the right people, including financial leadership. We've talked about how getting that leadership team in the executive bus is essential and knowing that you have the right people in the right seats and where that CFO fits onto that bus. We talked about how so many growth businesses hit a ceiling in business as they're moving from one stage to the next, and how lucky for us, that's when we often get called because recognizing that in order to move to the next business stage, I need to invest in financial leadership is something that we see a lot in the market. We talked about what does it mean to need a CFO and that idealistic story and how for our clients, the ones that invest in a CFO, when they hit $1 million, they have goals to be over $5 million in revenue, their team is over 10 people, and they have investor or banking relationships. That's the ideal point to get a CFO if you have all four or a few of those criterias. And then who is a CFO and how does that compare to the other people on the accounting and finance team? Before we wrap this discussion of navigating business and how growth businesses need the right people, process, and technology, I just want to open the floor to talk about that process and technology part, Jesse, and where that comes into play and what the right time to invest, for example, in NetSuite, which is the ERP that we sell, which is a way of getting your process and technology up to date for a scalable business. When do you think you should be looking at that as you navigate business?
I mean, it should start in the planning phase in terms of your business plans at the end of the day, right? Like, where are you going? You know, what does your goals look like and how are you going to support it? So it should be on the roadmap. It should be planned for. Unfortunately, most clients, again, don't do that. They generally call when things are broken, right? And it's going to cost you a lot more money and time to fix a broken problem than to fix it from the start. So, you know, I think, you know, and what life cycle that is in a business, you know, I talk about employees, the earlier the better. You know, do it early, it'll be a lot cheaper. It'll be a lot less of a problem when you have to yell, put up your hand for help.
Absolutely. So that's our discussion on growth businesses and how they can grow with the right people, including financial leadership, and looking at how financial strategy can be supported by the people and process and technology that gets it done. Thanks for joining us at Let's with Amplify.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's with Amplify. We hope you enjoyed the show and got some value out of today's talk. If you did, we'd love to hear from you. We invite you to leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform or comment on YouTube, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to check out more information on all of our episodes and free ebooks, visit amplifyadvisors.ca/category/Let's Media. Production of the podcast is by @Heart Creative and can be found at @heartcreative.com.